So now we'll begin the conference with the first keynote session, which will be conducted in English. May I now invite Professor Catherine Hardy again to the stage to introduce and welcome our first keynote speaker today. Professor Hardy, please.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for coming, and let me join in extending a warm welcome to you all to this weekend's conference. So it is my honor to introduce our first keynote speaker for the conference, and that is Professor Mattia Salvini, Dhammavardhana Yanagaba, let me tell you a little bit about him. He received a BA and MA in Sanskrit at RKM Vivekananda College in Chennai, in India. He also received then a PhD from SOAS. While working on his PhD, he began teaching first at the Ranjung Yeshi Institute in Nepal and then at the International Buddhist College in Thailand. He then worked for Mahidol University in Thailand and then came back to the International Buddhist College in 2019, where he now serves as Rector and Dean of Liberal Arts. His main interest is in the continuation of the Sanskrit Buddhist tradition, for which purpose he coordinates the Salgatam platform online under the guidance of his teacher, Tsuchung Gyatsen, Lama Ao Ngawang Tsuchung Gyatsen. His academic writing focuses on Madhyamaka and on the connections between Buddhist philosophy and different areas of Sanskrit learning. He has published with Routledge, Equinox, Oxford University Press, and the Journal of Indian Philosophy, among other places. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Salvini. He will be speaking today on the topic of 2 Sanskrit verses on Sukhavati, prosody chanting, and the transmission of Buddhism from language to language and from place to place. Please, Professor Salvini.
Namo mita bhaya, namo mita yushe. Namo namo chintya gunakaratmane, namo mita bhaya jinayate mune, sukhavatim yami tavanukampaya, sukhavatim kanakavichitrakananam, manoramam sugata sutairalam kritam, tavashrayam pratitayashasya dhimatah, prayamitam bahumaniratna sanchayam, prayamitam bahugunaratna sanchayam, Prayamitam bahuguna ratna sanchayam. Thank you for having me here. Thank you for coming to listen to me. And especially thank you to Professor Halkias. And a special thank to Dr. Mingyuan Gao, who has sent me a new text just 2-3 days ago, which kind of completely changed my presentation. So, in fact, you might have noticed that even the title has changed, but this was mostly for aesthetic purposes. I thought this title sounds better than the old one. The content still is similar. So, you can see that the title starts with Namo Namo. I will show you where this comes from. That is a crucial point in this verse. I think you would agree that I have chanted 2 verses. Yes, these are 2 verses, I chanted them. This might seem like a very simple thing to say, but I will show you that it's not that simple. So these 2 verses are the topic of my entire talk. And the title of the talk comes from a footnote, this particular footnote. This is a footnote to Ashikaga's edition of the larger Sukhavati Vyuha Sutra, and this happens to be the footnote 1 on page 1, and the footnote just says Namo Namo. Now, for many years, I had chanted these two verses, but chanted them as one verse and a half. And for a long time, I felt uncomfortable about it, because we do have this happening in Sanskrit with Anushtup type of meter, that sometimes we have 6 padas, but it's very strange to have a half verse in 1 meter and then an entire verse in another meter. And so for a long time, I felt so uncomfortable. Like, I was chanting it for my own interest, but I felt there is something wrong with this. So later on, I found Ashikaga's edition, and here it is. This is how the verses appear in his edition. And as you can see, here it is still 1 verse and a half. So this is a half verse. From Namo Mitabhaya Jinayate Mune, from here, this is a half verse up to Anukampaya, and then we have an entire verse. But when I looked at this, I thought, no, Namo Mitabhaya, Namo Mitayushe, Namo Chintya. Now, when you get to this point, you can hear that there's a rhythm. So what I realized is that that footnote was actually not so desirable emendation of a manuscript reading. So the manuscript reading, which is provided by the editor as Namo Namo, that's actually a good reading. So this repetition, Namo Namo, gives us a perfect verse. And so I worked towards a new edition of the verse, just to realize a few days ago that a new edition has already been made. So, but the new edition actually catches it as a verse, which was great. Now, another rather interesting feature is that 2 manuscripts that I have seen, we can see that the Namo has been dropped, and in one of them, the Namo appears, the single Namo appears at the edge, like at the end of a line. So we can understand why it might have been dropped. But the interesting thing is that this Namo only appears in what is regarded to be the best manuscript. It doesn't appear elsewhere, and other editions don't have it. Well, this is quite remarkable to me, because most of what I'm going to say about these verses just falls apart entirely when we remove that repetition. So this single repetition of Namo changes the format, probably changes the use of these verses, and changes how we can read them completely. So this to me also is something that shows the importance of textual criticism for the transmission of Buddhism. How important it is that we continue to study Buddhist languages, and that we continue to read and even reread Buddhist texts. And I would say to chant them, because on my part I was able to catch this thanks to chanting. Meaning that there's a lot about prosody that we can acquire intuitively by chanting. The ability to recognize that something is a verse, even when we read it in a format which doesn't present it as a verse on a page, which manuscripts normally don't do. So, I hope that I will convince you of the importance of chanting. These 2 verses are in 2 meters called Vamshastha and Ruchira. So the first verse is in Vamshastha, the second one is in Ruchira meter. Now, the Vamshastha happens to be a meter which I believe is used in the Sukhavati Vyuha itself. Although it seems to me that several of the Vamshastha verses I've seen are slightly irregular. It's something I have to look into more carefully, because the verses of the Sukhavati Vyuha are not in perfectly regular Sanskrit. So actually dealing with the meter as well is a more complex matter too. The Vamshastha is also found used prominently in Buddhist poetry. Remarkably, almost an entire chapter of Ashvaghosha's Buddha Charita is in Vamshastha meter. This is the metric subdivision according to Guru and Laghu. I have marked the Yati, the Caesura, but I think the yati, the caesura, these pauses are not so important to the Vamshasta meter. In fact, I believe that in this particular verse, they have been used differently, and they have been put to very good use. This special use of Vamshasta has something to do with the content of the verses. Here is Ratnakara Shanti's Chando Ratnakara definition of the Vamshasta. Ushanti Vamshastam idam jarau. I think you can hear Namo Mita Bhaya, Namo Mita Ayushe. It's the same rhythm. So this definition is a technical definition which is based on groupings of the 3 syllables which have codes. The codes are jata, jara, and at the same time it is also an example of this meter. So that's how meters are often presented in treatises on meter. Why am I choosing Ratnakara Shanti? He's a Buddhist author. And it might not be far in time and in place from these 2 verses. Now, here is the same Vamshasta in Jnana Shri Mitra. Jnana Shri Mitra was, let's say, a colleague of Ratnakara Shanti, and also someone who had debates with Ratnakara Shanti, both philosophically and also in terms of meter. Because his idea was, why do we need codes? We can just exemplify the meters without the codes. And he wrote this very beautiful treatise and praise of Manjushri, which is each verse contains the name of a certain meter, and that name, through a double meaning, is also part of a meaning of a verse as a praise of Manjushri. So this is also an aspect of Sanskrit literature which is relevant to these verses, the ability to present 2 or more things at the same time. And I will show that this is actually quite important to these particular verses. So this is Asamshayam Tvam Apareshu Satswapi Prakama Sarvatma Gunanuharishu Ananya Sadharana Yadhiya Dipa Ushanti Vamshastham Anangajishnavaha. Now this has a very nice meaning. It's about how the Buddhas especially praise Manjushri as being the one who is placed in the Vamsha. So in this way, Jnana Shri Mitra, according to the commentary as well, has given us an interesting meaning for the word Vamshasta, Vamshe Buddha Vamshe Tishtati, meaning someone who is placed in the lineage of the Buddhas. So this is actually an idea that recurs in the Mahayana, that in fact Mahayana practice is partly for the non-discontinuity of the lineage of the Buddhas. So this practically means that the word Vamshasta is interpreted as meaning a bodhisattva. So the meaning of the name of the meter of the first verse can be understood as bodhisattva. The second meter is the Ruchira, which has a meaning which I think fits very well with the content of the verse, which is on Amitabha and Sukhavati. Ruchira means resplendent or brilliant, but also pleasing or agreeable. So it relates to 2 themes which are presented in these verses. One is, of course, the idea of luminosity, the luminosity of Amitabha. And the other one is prasada. Prasada is a term which is variously translated as faith or devotion. It's actually, its correspondent in the Tibetan tradition is what is most frequently translated as devotion, but prasada actually means clarity. And so its meaning also overlaps with luminosity. Here is the subdivision of the Ruchira meter. Here, in this particular verse, the yati that is very important is the one that appears here. So the pause after the 4th syllable. Sukhavatim, Kanakavichitra Kananam, etc. So that pause happens to be very important. I will show you why. This is how Ruchira is defined by Ratnakara Shanti. Javau najauriti Ruchira Chaturgrahehi. And here we have another verse of Jnana Shri Mitra. Maybe I will not read it because otherwise I don't have enough time. But this verse is extremely beautiful and it focuses on splendor. It's an image of Ratnakara actually, which is quite interesting, of the ocean as the mine of jewels. So the idea is that the ocean is full of jewels and gems. And it says that only if we were to remove all the water and we would see all these gems, we could have a comparable splendor like the one of bodhisattvas such as yourself, Manjushri. That's the overall sense of the verse. So the main sense in which Jnana Shri Mitra takes it is that it's luminous or bright. This supports my idea that maybe there is a connection between the choice of a verse with this name and the theme of the verse. Now, I said I read 2 verses. Now I want to propose that maybe I read 3 verses. Because thanks to the caesura, and thanks to the general characteristic of the second verse, and this is very, very clear, I think, in the second verse, we can stop here. You see, Sukhavatim, Kanakavichitra Kananam, Manoramam, Sugadasutairalam Kratam, Tavashrayam, Pratitayashasya Dhimataha, Prayamitam, Bahugunaratna Samchayam. We can actually have a strong stop after 4 syllables. What does it mean? We can read this as a verse. So we can take everything, all the first 4 syllables of this verse, and we get a different verse. Sukhavati manoharam tavashrayam prayamitam, which is actually, I feel, a rather nice short verse. The meaning also is a complete meaning. It makes perfect sense. And this type of meter is attested. It's attested as the Jaya, victory meter. Here it is in the Vrittamala Stuti. Samashrayas kalanmale surasura dishudgateihi. I've not translated this because this verse is in a longer sentence, so it doesn't make sense on its own. Now, I want to point out that even if we don't take it as really a separate verse, nevertheless, this highlights something about how we perceive this verse, which is we do see that this part kind of makes sense on its own. So in some sense, we are perceiving this poem in more than one direction. This is partly because of the syntax, in the sense that there is one element in the first 4 syllables, which is then expanded upon in the rest. But that is a main element, and all the main elements in these 4 syllables are consistent. They work among themselves. Now let's take it one step further. Are there 2 verses actually within the verse? I think it's possible. Let's look at the second verse. Namo mita bhaya, namo mita yushe, namo namo chintya, gunakaratmane, namo mita bhaya, jinayate mune, sukavatim yami, tavanukampaya. Now you see, here the pause is after the 6th syllable, so exactly at half of the pada. Now, here we can take this part, and this makes for a nice verse on its own. Namo mitayushe gunakaratmane jinayate mune tavanukampaya. And we can put it together, the verse that we got earlier, Sukavatim manoharam tavashrayam prayamitam, and then the meaning we get is this. Homage to Amitayus, who is a mind of good qualities, to you, victor sage, by your compassion I go to Sukhavati, your attractive abode. Maybe we can take it one step further. So maybe there's 3 verses embedded. Now, what we can do is actually to read the first half of what appears before the yati. And then, if we put it together with the second half of what we find in the second verse, we can get this meaning. So we can read it like this. Namo mitabhaya, namo namo chintya, namo mitabhaya, sukavatim yami, kanaka vichitra kananam, sugata sutairalam kratam, pratidayasasya dhimatah, bahuguna ratna sanchayam. And it still makes sense. This also makes sense, and the meaning is the one I'm showing here. This is also, by the way, because here we can have a shlesha, meaning that we can take achintya, this word, outside of a compound. Instead of qualifying what comes after, we can take achintya as meaning inconceivable one. So there is also this element which is called shlesha in Sanskrit. It means when 2 different meanings or more meanings are embraced through some kind of linguistic stratagem. Or maybe there are 4 extra verses. Because we can take the first half of each pada of the first verse, and then we read it with the first half. So this first half also makes sense. And then we get this. Namo mitabhaya, namo namo chintya, namo mitabhaya, sukavatim yami, sukavatim manoramam, tavashrayam prayamitam. Here's another one. Also, the verse that we obtain by reading the first half of each pada of verse 1 can be read in a different order. We can read it as Namo mitabhaya, namo namo chintya, namo mitabhaya, sukavatim yami. But we can also read it as Namo mitabhaya, namo mitabhaya, namo namo chintya, sukavatim yami. And this gives 2 possible meanings. Homage to Amitabha, homage to Amitabha, homage to the inconceivable one, I go to Sukhavati. Or it can mean, and this is the one I like best, Namo Mitabha, Namo Mitabha, Namo Namo, I go to the land of bliss beyond thought, by taking Achintya together with Sukhavati. So this is also possible. And this, so let me now give a scheme for these verses. This is how we can get 6 verses, you see? First verse, second verse, here, 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 and here. So this way we get 6 verses. Now, there are more possibilities, actually, because we can read each of the padas starting from the last, going back to the first, and it makes perfect sense. We can also read them by skipping one, like first, third, second, fourth, and same thing for the second verse. And there's probably more possibilities that I haven't thought of. So we can do lots of things with these verses. Now, what does this remind me of? Well, it reminds me of at least 3 different things. Number 1, this is a Chitrakavya. These verses is not exactly Chitrakavya, but Chitrakavya is a type of poetry wherein the syllables are connected in such a way that if you were to write them down, they will give you certain decorative diagrams. It also reminds me of Shlesha Kavya, so the type of Kavya which presents more meaning at once. And for this, I would like to mention Igal Bronner's work, he focused on how we can simultaneously perceive different things in one verse. And also riddles. There's a famous treatise on riddles called Vidagdha Vismapana, that which will amaze clever people, by Ratnakara Shanti, the same as the Chando Ratnakara author. And some of the riddles also create diagrams. And thirdly, it reminds me of these. Well, mandalas. I think this is another aspect. If you remember how I showed the verses earlier, I think you can see that there is a certain analogy. Lastly, it reminded me of this. Since we are in Hong Kong, I thought I would... I think you can understand why. And let me now shift to, well, I have 7 minutes, I'll do my best. Let me shift to a different feature of this verse, which is it has a lot of repetitions. Now, this feature, one of the points I really want to highlight is that this is the only Sanskrit text that I know where we have a repetition, Namo Mitabhaya, Namo Mitabhaya. Now, is this significant? Does this have anything to do with East Asian Buddhism? Well, this is something that I would like to leave very open. But I will show that there is even possibly some historical justification to speak in these terms. Now, these repetitions that I have highlighted here in the verse do different things. I think they create some resonance with different aspects of Pure Land practice. So Namo Mitabhaya, of course, this is a repetition of Amitabha's name. The position in the verse is extremely striking because this is the first expression in at the very beginning of each of half verse, which I find really striking. Then we have Namo, 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 Namo. So we have a lot of Namo, and especially we have this Namo, Namo, which was unfortunately not always transmitted and also not always included in the editions. Now, this is something which is often used in Buddhist poetry to express devotion and faith. And one good example is here from the Buddha Charita, Saundarananda, where actually Ashwagosha even says that he's going to repeat something. He says he's going to do punaruktam, which means a repetition. So there's a kind of a metatextual feature. Then Amita, 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 Amita. Sorry, Amita, Amita, Amita. So what does this mean in practice is that we have both 3 times the name, because we have Amitabha and Amitayo, which here are considered clearly the same. Then we have Guna Guna. Guna Guna actually has 2 very nice features. One is that it connects Amitabha to Sukhavati, because Amitabha is the mind, the source of all these good qualities, and Sukhavati is where all these good qualities are. And this, we know, has something to do also with doctrine, how Amitabha relates to a lot of Sukhavati as being his nirmana. And also, Gunakara, I would like to point out, can be taken as a synonym of Dharmakara, because the word Dharma can also mean a quality. So in that case, we also have a connection to Dharmakara as the Bodhisattva before he becomes Amitabha Buddha. Then we have Sukhavati, of course, and here what is significant is where this repetition of Sukhavati appears, which means the first verse is about Amitabha, the second one is about his Sukhavati. You can see this, and this means also that Sukhavati here is a kind of Uddesha, first mention, and then it is repeated for a Nirdesha, an explanation. So it connects these 2 verses also as Uddesha Nirdesha. Yami Prayami, now this is a very nice touch because Yami means I go. And this is normally not used for something which happens in the distant future. So this is the opposite of what happens in a famous verse of the Kalidasa, Yasyat Shakuntale Tirdayam, etc. So there a sage has to relinquish his adopted daughter, Shakuntala, and instead of saying she's going, which is what one should do when somebody is just about to go, one should say yati, he says yasyati. And even the commentators point out it's because he's not eager. And so this is a way to indicate. This is the opposite, because here one should say yasyami, I will go to Sukhavati. But instead he says yami, which indicates 2 things, certainty and eagerness. And I think, well, I don't have enough time to say much more, but at least you can see how this relates to certain features of Pure Land practice. Now, this verse also relates to 3 types of Shraddha. but I will not go into it. The 3 types of faith, we can identify them in the verses. But now I want to show you something else. Yes, I have to, unfortunately, I cannot go into more detail about all the things which resonate with Sukhavati practice in the verses, but now there is something else I want to introduce. I hope you don't mind if I just take 2 minutes longer. Numbers, this is what I want to introduce, numbers. So the first thing is this. The verses can be counted as 6. How relevant is the number 6? I think it's a bit relevant. Namo Mita Bhaya, 6. Also, we have 6, Amitabha is praised 6 times, as Amitabha, Amitayuh, Achintya Gunakaratman, and Amitabha, Jina, and Muni. Now, 6 is less interesting. This is the less interesting number. The more interesting number, to me, is this. Vamshastamitra has 12 syllables. Ruchira has 13 syllables. So 48 and 52. 48 and 52 makes 100. Why is this significant? Because I think that these 2 verses perhaps could be regarded as a dharani. There's a class of dharanis which have 100 syllables. Famously, the Vajrasattva Shatakshara, which is found in the Sarvadhataka Tattva Sangraha Tantra, but others too. There's not just one, actually. And I think there is some other justification. Well, for example, there is a dharani for the names of Amitayu is in 108 syllables. Also, very interesting thing that I recently found out, these verses in Chinese twice were not translated. They were transliterated. They were rendered phonetically. So they once in, I think this note implies that they were transliterated through Chinese characters. But one time in Siddham, which I think is even more remarkable and maybe even supporting more that this could be a dharani. And if I understand what these texts are, I think these are ritual manuals for practice. So if this is true, and this is something I need to check with sinologists, that supports my idea that it could be a dharani even more. Also, if we look at the introductory section, the prose section right before the verses, I think it supports it even more. Now, I wanted to discuss Yaqub Ahmed for the transmission of Buddhism in general. He said, I'll just mention one thing that he said, which I really liked. He's a historian of the Ottoman Empire. And one point he made was how the repetitions that are done during Arabic prayers have something to do with the Islamic conceptions of time. And this is something that came to my mind while reading these verses. And also something that I think should be considered for historiography, but I cannot get into it for time. Then I would just recommend you to read In Praise of Shadows if you haven't. This is actually a very instructive text on architecture, but I think it has something to do with how placing things in the right light might allow us to understand them better. And they will finish just by showing you an image, which I think is an image of Amitabha, although not explicitly, because strictly speaking, this is an image of a waterfall, the Amida waterfall by Hokusai, and I'm showing it to you because I think it reminds me of these verses. And, well, I will not explain how, but maybe you can somewhat guess it. So, thank you very much. Sorry that I took longer.
Thank you very much, Professor Salvini, for the wonderful presentation and the beautiful chanting as well. So we now have 15 minutes for questions from the audience. So please feel free to raise your hand if you'd like to ask something.
Well, thank you, Mattia, for this wonderful presentation and this intriguing, like variation of these initial verses. And I'm very convinced what you found out. But the question is, do you think that, in ancient India, the scholars had a similar view of these verses? I mean, could you trace some evidence that, the tradition has played with all these variations,
No, not really.
I don't want to belittle your findings, they are obviously original, but...
No, I don't have such type of evidence because I've not seen these verses used in any other text. So I cannot provide evidence as in, let's say, there is an Indian commentary which says the same thing. And in fact, I don't present this as certainty. I think that you can see this in two different ways. One is that, well, three different ways. One is that it was actually intended to be read in this manner with various ways of composition. Another way is just some reflection on the very structure of the verses, because this is not something that you can do with just any verses anyhow. And this, I think, does affect the way in which we perceive the verses when we read them. And thirdly, one could consider that, well, yes, they were not intended in that manner, but they were perceived as such by some commentators later. But this is purely speculative because, as I said, I don't have any commentaries which actually say that. So just to clarify, I'm not claiming this is a well-established way to read these verses. But I want to highlight a possibility, which I think in itself, even just as a possibility, is very striking.
Anyway, it's amazing. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah.
Okay.
Any further questions for Professor Salvini?
Well, because I'm not really an expert in any of those. You just did it for this one particular verse. Could you continue this line of work and see if that is actually a regular phenomena? Or that's just your discovery for this particular two verses?
Well, I mentioned Chitrakavya, for example, and riddles and Shlesha. So this type of literature, especially the Shlesha, starts taking off in the second millennium in Sanskrit literature. It's not that popular in the first millennium, but then it becomes really very popular. And actually, there are one of the most famous Shlesha Kavyas is by a Buddhist author, the Kappina Abhyudaya. And there was a tradition, for example, of writing chapters of a longer poem that could be read as two different stories by splitting them in different ways. So this is a very well-established tradition, not exactly in this format. But when I look at these verses, they do remind me of this larger tendency of, let's say, valuing ambivalence and valuing simultaneous readings. Now, this is part of a broader feature, I think, in Sanskrit literature and Buddhist literature, which is interestingly antithetical to modern academic writing in a way. But ambivalence, ambiguity, multiple meanings, it's something that the tradition deeply, deeply values. And I think this is one way in which this is presented, and this can be presented sometimes playfully, sometimes due to esoteric reasons, but like riddles, in that case, is clearly playful. In other cases, I think it can be also for embedding more esoteric meanings.
Okay.
Yes, thank you very much, Mattia, for your presentation. I have two, if you could just elaborate on 2 points. I was very much intrigued on the notion of time that you mentioned, whether it's linear or it's cyclical, and maybe you can elaborate a little bit of what did you have in mind when you mentioned this. And the second part that I'm very interested is the 3 types of faith, that you mentioned, and how do those relate to taking rebirth in Sukhavati?
Okay, so regarding the first question is a very big question. I'll try to explain it very briefly. This was more of a reflection on historiography, how Buddhist authors think of history, how most modern academics think of history. I think that sometimes modern academics do not reflect on the nature of time and perception. You can see that this is thematized explicitly by Buddhist historians that mention that an event can be perceived as according to two completely different times, and both these accounts are valid. This has to do with certain presuppositions about the nature of perception. I have discussed this a very long time with a historian friend, and my surprise is that people who are trained as historians are sometimes more open to discussing these things. My friend Daud Alid, he's a historian of mostly medieval India, and I was mentioning about, this was like a quarter of a century ago, how there's a different understanding of time at play in the Buddhist text. And he was saying that, yes, this has been researched, for example, regarding medieval prophecy. Like prophecies were taken very seriously in medieval Europe. And he was saying that somebody has pointed out that this was partly because the three times in their theology were regarded as much more connected than how one might speak of them in a contemporary setting. And Yaqub Ahmed, the context of his mention was that he was saying traditional scholars, traditionally trained scholars who decide to write about Islamic history should not feel shy to reflect on how traditional notions of time, which they might be very convinced of, might be reflected in historiography, like even use them as intellectual tools. And this is also something that I want to bring up, that within the Buddhist tradition, I feel sometimes those of us who are Buddhist or convinced of Buddhist ideas feel very shy to employ ideas or frameworks which come from the Buddhist tradition itself. And I think there is no reason. There's no reason why we have to rely on Aristotle rather than Dharmakirti. Personally, I prefer Dharmakirti. So this should be a matter of personal preference and intellectual conviction, and we should have a freedom to do that. As for your second question, the classification of three types of faith is found in several Abhidharma treatises. Let me see if I can briefly bring it up. The first one is called Abhisampratyayakara. Abhisampratyayakara means faith in the aspect of believing that something is there or is true. The second one is the Prasadakara, which is the one which is more popular, which is faith as a kind of clarity of mind or good disposition, devotion towards something which exists, is true, and has good qualities. And the third one is Abhilasha Akara, faith as longing, as wishing to obtain or to bring into existence something which is true and which has good qualities. And I feel that these are all represented in this verse, especially the word yami, prayami, I go, actually I think represents two of them. It represents the first one because it has a sense of certainty, and it also represents the longing to go there. The rest of the verses can be taken to relate to prasada, which also happens to be described as, like this type of clear faith, has been described, as you know, by Mipo Rinpoche as ultimately the real main cause to be reborn in Sukhavati. And this idea that faith is really what counts also, I believe, reappears in the East Asian traditions. So I think we can read the verse also in these terms. Of course, this is a very abhidharmic reading, but is found, this is such a common classification that I think it's perfectly justifiable.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Okay, we will have one final question. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for your very excellent presentation. Is this Namo Namo repetition is rare in the Sanskrit literature or devotional text?
It's not rare. It's not. In fact, I mentioned it's also in the Saundarananda.
Yeah.
I remember reading a grammatical commentary where a sub-commentator mentioned that the Mangalacharana, the auspicious verse, which has Namo Namo, it's due to great devotion. So this is, in fact, it's very common at the end of pada. Namo Namaha, like this kind of ending is something that we find again and again and again. There's even it's so common. I think it's used so much in the Buddhist tradition. In Thailand recently they made a pop song with Namo Namo. So this is something. This is common. It is not there.
Yeah, I also recall so when I was a child, I memorized the text. I don't remember the name of the text. So it also similar way. Namo Namo Buddha Divakaraya, Namo Namo Gautama Chandimaya. So the parts I don't remember, but very similar. I said some sort of devotional, so paying homage. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, indeed. So that would be Pali because it's a Chandima. Namo Namo Buddha Divakaraya, Namo Namo Gautama Chandimaya. Yes. Yeah, so in Pali also we can find it definitely. So it's interesting that it was transmitted only in one manuscript. But this can happen if a bunch of manuscripts are all related to each other. So the number doesn't always mean that much, actually. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Salvini. Please join me again in expressing our thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.